Now, lastly, I want to go ahead and introduce our speaker today, Dr. Gleb. Dr. Gleb is an internationally recognized thought leader on a mission to protect meeting planners from dangerous judgment errors known as cognitive biases by developing the most effective decision-making strategies. This presentation is based on his best-selling book, Resilience, Adapt and Plan for the New Abnormal of the COVID-19 coronavirus pandemic. His cutting-edge thought leadership was featured in over 550 articles and 450 interviews in prominent venues such as Inc. Magazine, Entrepreneur, CBS News, Time, Business Insider, and much more. His expertise stems from his background of over 20 years of consulting, coaching, speaking, and training as CEO of disaster avoidance experts. It also comes from his research background as a behavioral economist and a cognitive neuroscientist with over 15 years in academia and with dozens of peer-reviewed articles published in academic journals. So everyone, without further ado, I would like to welcome today's speaker, Dr. Gleb. Dr. Gleb, thank you so much for being here today. We really appreciate your time and all your efforts in working with us to get this started.
You're so kind, Jerica. Thank you for your wonderful introduction. I really appreciate this. And I am looking forward to sharing about this material, which might not be as fun to hear as many folks would like. There's not too many good news, unfortunately. But fortunately, there's things you can do to address it, right? Otherwise, what's the point of checking this out? So we'll be talking about adaptation and planning for project managers for the COVID-19 coronavirus pandemic. And as we start, I want you to go to this poll that you see. So there's going to be a poll that's part of the webinar, and it's going to be using a software called Vivox, which is a great polling software, allows completely anonymous polling. So if you go to this link, https / the regular thing, vivox.com app, vivox.app /m square hashtag, then /171039747. It's all on your screen. It's also in the chat. So you can go to the chat and you can see the link and you can click on the chat there. I will give you 30 seconds to do so. So please go to the link. Again, you will see the poll in the chat and also on the screen. And this is one of the tools that you will be able to use, of course, for effective virtual meetings. So you'll want to see how it works from the inside out. So make sure to go there. All right, great. So you've gone there, and hopefully now that you've gone there, you see the question that's there. When do you think most people will return to conferences over 100 people? So when do you think? Let's take another 30 seconds to vote. See that we have lots of folks voted. So 82 out of 85. So we have 150 participants and we have 85 votes. So let's get more. Let's get 15 more seconds for you to vote. All right. So it's the end. I'm going to close the poll now. So you'll see what the functionality is like when I close the poll. And then I'll let you see the results. So hopefully you're all able to see the results on that same website. So you'll see that for the various votes, end of 2020 for over 100, for people returning to conferences, over 100 people. Very few of you think that by the end of 2020 that will happen. So specifically about just under 8%. And I have to tell you that there are some folks who still are planning in-person conferences by the end of 2020. But given that there's going to be very few people who are going to be attending, I'm not sure how wise of a move that is. So that's something to think about. Now, for summer of 2021, 50% of you. So this is the majority of you. This is the largest category. Think it's going to be by the summer of 2021. Most of the rest who are there think it's going to be by the end of 2021. So about a third of you think it'll be then. And then summer of 2022, there's 7%, and end of 2022, there's just under 4%. So that's kind of a commentary and will allow you to see what the people who you are engaged with virtual meetings are thinking about various topics, allow you to comment on it, allow you to analyze it. So this is a tool that you can use to adapt to virtual meetings or hybrid meetings. That's an example of a tool, and we'll of course be using this throughout the presentation, so please make sure to leave that screen up. Now, the interesting thing is this is not only a poll for you, and this is a way that you can use this in your presentations and help the speakers who you hire use this tool if they're not using something like that, and yourself as facilitators, as hosts, make sure to use tools like this. And as part of it, you can link to what people actually do. So if you know that there's a certain poll result, there's polling, then you want to actually give people an answer that is relevant to the topic. And so there was a poll, there was a study of 126 executives who regularly attend conferences. And so there was a study of them, and the study asked, and these are people who are your clients, who are actually the people who go to conferences, executive from finance, healthcare, a lot of other different fields. Survey of 126 executives who regularly attend conferences on when they will go back to conferences. Over 90%, literally over 90% of the people say they want to see the virus go away. They want an effective vaccine before returning to conferences. They really don't want to go back to conferences before there's an effective vaccine, an effective treatment. So this is an example of what one of them said. I don't want to wear a mask at a conference. There is a strong reluctance among your clients, customers, people who go to conferences all the time to do that. I myself have about 13,000 LinkedIn followers. So just shortly before this meeting, I ran a similar poll, and yeah, it was overwhelmingly people would not be going to conferences unless there's a vaccine, unless there's an effective vaccine, effective treatment. They don't like the idea of going to conferences in masks, and it just doesn't feel connecting, it doesn't feel engaging. They'd much rather do virtual events. So that is something that you can use. There's the large majority of you think that conferences will be, that the people go back to conferences by this summer of 2020, by that end of 2021, so by the summer of 2021 or end of 2021. So that's kind of what the large majority of you think. But there's at that point, so what will happen to the vaccine? The vaccine is the critical element in what happens. So that's how you have to think about it. It's not going to be the timing, it's going to be the vaccine that determines whether people go back to conferences. And what are the timelines for vaccines? And this is my area of expertise. I'm a disaster avoidance expert. I do risk management, decision-making, strategic planning. That's what I've been studying for over 20 years, as Jared kindly mentioned. And I'm a cognitive neuroscientist and behavioral economist who studies how we think about these topics, how our brain goes wrong when we think about various complex issues. And there's very many ways that we make bad decisions around the pandemic. So let's talk a little bit about vaccines, just to get on the same page. It's the only effective solution to bring back people to conferences over 100 people, and in general to address the pandemic. And human trials, you've probably heard, everything, phase 1 trial, phase 2 trial, phase 3 trials. They need to test the safety of the vaccine and the effectiveness of the vaccine. This is why if you're hearing something about Russia getting an approved vaccine, why this will never fly in the US, because they are getting a vaccine that has not been tested for safety and effectiveness. We've created a number of vaccines, the Moderna vaccine and so on, but we don't know whether they're safe or whether they're effective. Russia created one vaccine and they're just injecting it into people. They think it will be safe and effective. But what if it's not? This is incredibly dangerous. This is not something that will happen in the US. These trials are estimated to take at least a year. So at least a year, and that is when we cut all the red tape and throw all the money possible at it. That'll take at least a year. Usually they take 4 to 5 years. That's the first thing to realize about vaccine, when we'll have a vaccine. And you know that Moderna, if you've looked at that, the Moderna vaccine went into trials in March of this year, so March 2020. So the earliest possible vaccine point would be March 2021. That's the earliest possible point when there's a vaccine possible. Now, what we have to realize as part of this is that most vaccines don't make it through human trials. This is tragic and unfortunate, but they don't. The large majority of vaccines don't make it through human trials. Especially, that's the case when vaccines are rushed into production. They are very unlikely to be successful. There was a study that came out in prominent peer-reviewed journal, Cell, that showed that COVID-19 has mutated since its original strain rose up in Wuhan, China, into a much more virulent strain, one that's much more infectious. So about 3 to 9 times more infectious. And right now, this new strain is the overwhelming strain in the US, in Europe, and most other places around the world, because it's just so much more infectious. Now, unfortunately, the vaccines that have been out, the first wave of vaccines, the Moderna vaccine, Johnson & Johnson, all of these vaccines were created based on the original strain in Wuhan, China. So we have no idea whether they'll be, they could produce antibodies against the original strain. We have no idea whether these antibodies will be effective against this new strain that's much more widespread. They may be, they may not be. But that's one of the many examples where it's very challenging to make the first wave of vaccines work, especially if they're rushed into production. And you have to realize that after they're ready, what would need to happen? It's not like, vaccine is ready and it's kind of magic. Everything's done, right? That's not what happens. The government would need to coordinate the process of producing it, distributing it, and vaccinating people. So that's going to be the process. Now, I don't know what you think, but I think that the US government has not proven very highly competent at the early stages of dealing with a vaccine, of providing ventilators, of providing personal protective equipment, of providing testing, of coordinating the response, of tracing people. And I'm not very optimistic about the way that the government will handle the production, distribution, and vaccination of vaccines of people, especially given that surveys show that only 50% of the population are really ready to take a vaccine. 20% refuse to take it under all circumstances, 30% aren't sure. So if we only have 50% of the population taking the vaccine, that's not going to be great either. We also don't know how long the vaccine immunity will last. So far, what we find is that COVID-19 immunity to regular COVID-19 cases, ones that aren't severe, the ones that the large majority of us get, which are either asymptomatic or kind of mild sinus, not very severe cases, the immunity antibodies fade within about 2 months, 2 to 3 months. So if we have to get booster shots every 2 to 3 months, that would be really difficult. So this is a very difficult problem to solve, logistics, money, and so on, and a public education campaign to convince people to take a vaccine. So with that in mind, what are the possible timelines here? We have an optimistic timeline, we have a moderate timeline, and we have a pessimistic timeline. And again, vaccine, and for people to go back to conferences over 100 people, for your attendees, like the business executives, they have to personally have a vaccine. And there will be, a lot of them will not be in the early wave of vaccinations because they're not essential workers who are working on the front lines. Going to conferences is unfortunately not seen as essential work by the government, which determines who to vaccinate first. So they will be at the tail end of the vaccination process. So it will be at the latter stages of vaccination. So we have an optimistic timeline, a moderate, and a pessimistic one. Here's the optimistic one. We get really lucky. We get one of the Moderna vaccines or the Johnson & Johnson, one of the first waves of vaccines is approved for mass production by summer of 2021. That's kind of, so at the earliest stage it can be approved is approximately March 2021, but that's the Moderna one and a couple of others which are entering third stage. There's one that's entering in September. So, let's say by summer 2021, we'll have approval. That will be very lucky. The production, distribution, vaccination. The government shows an extremely high level of competence in producing it, distributing it, and vaccinating people. And this is, by the way, an effective vaccine that's over 90% effective. So it's not, most executives don't care about, to go to a conference if they have a 50% chance less of catching the COVID-19. They want something that's solidly effective, so at least 90% effective. So by summer 2021, then production, distribution, vaccination takes 6 months because of super high level of government competence that has not been yet shown in the US response to vaccine, but maybe something like the South Korean government. We here in the US have over 150,000 people dead. Now in South Korea, they discovered the first case of COVID-19 at the same day that was discovered in the US. But in South Korea, they only have 300 people dead. So in South Korea is a huge country, 60 million people. The US has 330 million people. So it's about 4 times as much. So 4 to 5 times as much. So let's say even 5 times. South Korea would have had only 1,500 people dead if it was the same size of people as the US. And we have 150,000 people dead. That's 2 orders of magnitude. That's an order of magnitude more. So that's huge. Most people will be vaccinated then, in this optimistic case, by the start of 2022. So that's when people would return to conferences, by the start of 2022. That is, or by the end of 2021, same phraseology. So that's kind of when you want to be thinking about it. So that's the most optimistic timeline. That's very optimistic. It's 25% chance probability, no more than that. Because again, there's so many things that can go wrong. The early wave of vaccines might fail, and the government might not prove very competent in production, distribution, and vaccination. The moderate timeline. So this is something that's much more likely, unfortunately. One of the first waves of vaccines doesn't work. We have to go to the second wave or the third wave. So it will be approved by, let's say, start of 2023. Then production, distribution, vaccination with a moderate level of government competence, somewhat more competent than it has shown itself to be so far. It will take a year. And then most people will be vaccinated by 2024. So that's when they would start returning to conferences in the moderate scenario. The moderate scenario is much more likely than the optimistic one. It's twice as likely. It's 50% of all the probabilities. But that's not necessarily it sounds really bad, and it is bad. But that is not the world in which we might live. We might live in an even worse world. So let's take a look at the pessimistic timeline. Unfortunately, we have to think about pessimistic terms too. So vaccine will be approved for mass production, in that case, by 2026. That assumes that it's going to be surprisingly difficult to find a vaccine for COVID-19. Then production, distribution, vaccination, moderate level of competence will take a year, and most people will be vaccinated by 2027. And then that's when they'll be returning to conferences. This sounds harsh. This sounds very cynical. This sounds sad. And there's a 25% chance scenario that that's the world in which we'll live, unfortunately. And you might think it's too cynical, but do you know that we still don't have an effective vaccine for the flu? The vaccine we have for the flu is only 50% effective. It's unfortunate, but it's true. And we've been trying to get a vaccine for the flu for over a century. So this is bad. This is not good. And this is something that might very well happen. We have to be realistic about it and understand that that's something that we might be facing. So I want right now you to go back to the poll and take a look at the next poll now that we've talked about this situation, and have you think about which of these scenarios might you want to plan for and might you want to think about: the optimistic 2022, the moderate, the 2024, or the pessimistic of 2027. So please go ahead and start voting in the polls. Again, same website, same link. It's in the chat notes if you haven't had a chance to go to it, or if you accidentally closed out of it, please go ahead. You're welcome, Leandra. So Leandra says, thank you for optimistic painting a realistic picture of current affairs. You're welcome, Leandra. So I'm answering the chats while folks are talking about that. All right. So Norella asks where the poll is. I'm going to copy paste it again. I think you should be able to have it. Thank you, Emma. I appreciate you copy pasting that. Okay, I'll give people another 10 seconds to vote in the poll, because some apparently didn't, there was no awareness of where the poll was. Maybe folks signed on late. So please take a few more seconds to vote in the poll. Will it be planned for the optimistic, the moderate, or the pessimistic scenario? All right. So I'm going to close out the poll in 3 seconds. 3, 2, 1, close. All right, let's take a look at the results. So just under 40% of you will be planning for the optimistic scenario. Okay, and that's something you have to be aware of, that you're planning for the 25% chance scenario. Most of you will be planning for the moderate scenario. So that's the most likely scenario, the 50% scenario. So the just under 55% will be planning for that, and around under 7% will be planning for the pessimistic scenario. Great. So this is something you have to realize, and you have to think about how you're going to be planning going forward. And if you're planning for the optimistic scenario, you're putting in a lot of hope for the 25% chance scenario, and that people will start going back to conferences by the start of 2022, end of 2021. Then the moderate scenario, you'll be planning for people to go back to conferences by 2024, by the start of 2024. And then pessimistic, you'll be planning for people to go back to conferences of over 100 people. So any sizable conference, essentially, regional events and above, and national, of course. So regional and national. Local ones might have less than that, local chapter meetings, but regional and national events for 2027. Great. So let's take a look at thinking about how we make effective plans going forward. I want you to think about not planning for the optimistic scenario, the 40% of you who voted for it. I'm sorry, but that is problematic in many ways. So too many organizations, they act as though the problem will blow over soon. Folks, organizations, individuals, hope is not a strategy. It's hard to hear, and it's hard for me to convey this. It's really painful information. But it's really important to remember, really important, that hope is not a strategy, no matter how much you want it to be. That's a good phrase attributed to a famous coach, Vince Lombardi. I want you to strongly encourage you to prepare for the moderate or the pessimistic scenario. And in the rest of the presentation, we'll talk about why. Again, this is not easy to hear. When I was learning about this myself, I started looking at the pandemic early on. I wrote the book on this, Resilience, Adapt, and Plan for the New Abnormal, the COVID-19 coronavirus pandemic, because a publisher approached me after seeing some of my articles on this topic that I put out in op-ed editorials in Columbus Dispatch, other prominent Business Insider, Inc. magazine, other prominent venues, saying that people are greatly underestimating the impact and the likelihood and the extent of the pandemic. And I put that out in early March before it was a big thing. So then the publisher approached me and wanted me to write a book about it. So I started studying the pandemic way back in January, looking at it, examining it, and I realized it's going to be so much worse than we think. I struggled with this painful information, but people thought that, well, Wuhan, China, middle of nowhere, China, like who cares, right? Well, guess what? Wuhan is a huge city, 11 million people, produces over 22 billion of dollars of revenue per year. It's called the Chicago of China. That's kind of the visual you want to have it. It's the industrial heartland and business center of China in that sense, kind of the Chicago of China. It has over 200 international flights per day, and around 500 people per flight. Let's say one of those two-decker flights that go to China. That's around 10,000 people going into and out of Wuhan internationally every day. So of course it's going to spread. Of course, there's no question. There's a reason that the COVID-19 spread first to northern Italy. That's where it hit first, because that's the region of the world that has the closest ties, after, of course, Asia. So that's the region of the world that has the closest ties with Wuhan, with its clothing industry. My clients really also find it difficult to accept. And I have a number of meeting planner organization clients, coaching clients. They really find it difficult to accept, as well as other clients who I work with it. It's very uncomfortable information. They struggle a lot with it. But what helped me get over the hump and what helps them get over the hump is realizing that it will be much more painful in the long term for them, for me, if we don't accept and adapt to this really major disruption. There's a good phrase that Ray Dalio, who is manages a huge wealth investment fund, many billions of dollars, I think over 160 billion, when he wrote a post about the pandemic. But he said, I hope you imagine the worst case scenario and protect yourself against it. So that's what you got to be thinking about, protecting yourself against the downsides, against the risks. here's what we're facing until widespread vaccination. And we're already seeing this happening all over. We've been seeing loosened restrictions, some states too quickly, and then an increase in cases, especially in the states that loosened the restrictions too quickly. And then we see tighter restrictions, Texas, Florida, Arizona, and then decrease in cases. And what I can tell you is that pretty soon these states will open up again and there'll be looser restrictions. And then we'll have waves. We'll have waves and waves and waves, repeating waves of these looser restrictions increase in cases, tight restrictions decrease in cases every few months. That's what we're facing. That's the future that we're facing. So various levels of social distancing and shutdowns until a vaccine is widely available. And the world will change forever, and especially the meeting industry. These restrictions, people's not going to conferences over 100 people until vaccine and so on, they'll get used to virtual meetings, virtual interactions by this time. It'll be hard for them to do all the stuff that they usually did. They got in the habit of going to conferences, they got into the routines. It'll be really hard for them to restart it. You have to realize that. So people's habits will change, their values, what they care about will change, their desires will change, what they want will change, their behaviors, how they usually behave. The same conference that they go to every year, not held, not held, not held. Imagine, let's say, the moderate scenario. It's held virtually for the next 4 years. Who's going to come to an in-person one if they have adapted to a virtual one? It's something that we have to realize. We'll never go back to January 2020. We'll never go back to those good old days. And just to be clear, this is very painful for me, not only as a human, but very painful for me financially. I'm a speaker. That's how I make the large majority of my money. And as you can imagine, in March of 2020, this year, all of my speaking gigs were canceled, literally all of them. And one was canceled as I was just an hour away from getting to the airport. I was just preparing to call an Uber to take me to the airport. And I got a call from the meeting planner of this HR conference in Washington saying they decided to cancel it. And so that was hard, and that's really harsh. So I'm in the same boat in terms of really difficult situation as you are. I have to transition to all virtual, and many of you will have to do that in order to survive and thrive in this new world, or at least hybrid, where the large majority of the audience won't be in there and some speakers might be on stage. And we can talk about that. You have to realize that the pandemic is a slow-moving threat, and we make very bad decisions about such threats. The ones that are unusual, ones that are slow-moving, just because of how our brain is wired. We're not wired to make good decisions about such threats. Our gut reaction, what we feel, our intuitions are to really underestimate the extent, impact, and continuity of these threats. And that leads to bad decisions that endanger organizations, so the organizations for which you work as meeting planners, and your own careers, of course, in that sense. So let's talk about why bad advice is common. Like, go with your gut, follow your heart, trust your intuitions, because your intuitions tell you that people will go back to, half of you think that people will go back to conferences by summer of 2021. The rest of you, large majority of you think that it'll go back to, 1/3 think that it'll go back to by the end of 2021, and only 6% think it'll be past that. And I'm telling you that in the most optimistic scenario, it'll be by the end of 2021, and that's going to be pretty hard to achieve. We suffer from dangerous judgment errors, and that's my area of expertise as a cognitive neuroscientist, called cognitive biases. They come from a combination of our evolutionary background, how we evolved, and how our brains are wired. We have to understand that we didn't evolve for the modern environment. Our gut reactions, our intuitions, our instincts, what we feel comfortable with, those estimates, that feel-good estimate that we intuitively feel is right, is actually coming from instincts that are adapted to the savanna environment. That ancestral savanna, many thousands of years ago, when we lived in small tribes of 15 people to 150 people. That's what we're adapted for. And our primary response to threats in the savanna environment, and nowadays, how our gut reaction is and how we tend to make our decisions, is the fight or flight response. And that was great for hunter-gatherers. You might have heard of it as a saber-toothed tiger response. You had to jump at 100 shadows to get away from that one saber-toothed tiger. The risks they faced were immense, were immediate, intense in the moment, the saber-toothed tigers. But that's not the risks we face right now. Letting your decisions be driven by the fight or flight response is very dangerous in today's world. because the risks are much more long-term, uncertain, ambiguous. They might come as a notification on your smartphone about somebody forwarding you an article about some kind of disease arising in the middle of China, and you not paying attention to it because it doesn't seem relevant or important. Well, it can be much more important than you think. And there are three dangerous judgment errors I want to highlight that are particularly important here, okay? Really important. The normalcy bias, the planning fallacy, and hyperbolic discounting. So three cognitive biases you gotta address. Normalcy bias. We tend to look at the world and judge it by our immediate short-term past. That's our intuitions. That's how we feel. That's what we feel is right. When we think about ourselves 5 years from now, so think about yourself 5 years from now. What do you envision? Well, probably somewhat older, wider version of yourself, perhaps a few more gray hairs. That's kind of how we tend to envision ourselves. But if you look back to yourself 5 years ago, you'll probably realize that you're a very different person in many ways than you are right now. But we don't think that it's very likely that in 5 years we'll be just as different as we are now in 5 years from now. So as we were 5 years ago. That is incredibly important to realize, but it's not intuitive at all. And that's where we assume that everything will keep going normally. So we assume that everything will keep going as it is. But the modern world is not a good fit for that. In the Savannah environment, there's a safe assumption that the main changes will be the environment, spring, summer, fall, winter, right? That's the main changes in the future. That's not what's happening today. That's not what's happening to us. We change, we move in complex organizational structures, we develop our careers, we change our setting, our mindsets. We have extensive disruptions, technology disruption. I mean, how much has a smartphone changed our lives? The internet, social media. What about how much has your lives been changed by the fiscal crisis of 2008, 2009? And of course, this major crisis of the pandemic. We forecast the short-term future based on the short-term past, and we greatly underestimate the likelihood and the impact of major disruptions. Planning fallacy. Related to that, we assume that the future will go according to plan. We make a plan, we think the future will go according to plan, and we don't think about all the risks, problems, issues, challenges that might hit us. So we greatly underestimate problems and issues and threats, and therefore we underestimate the resources we need to solve them. Time, money, information, social capital, we don't go gather these resources. And we don't change our plans in a nearly timely enough manner when they're hit by major disruptors like the COVID-19 pandemic. I mean, if you haven't been looking at your strategic plan for your organization and your career, you gotta go through that and really change it extensively. I mean, for the moderate scenario, which is the most likely, that's, and ideally the pessimistic one, you're gonna have a lot of changes. Hyperbolic discounting. This is something really important to understand. We perceive the short-term future as much more important than the long-term future. This is why you see a lot of people rushing back to reopen, to go back to work, to open things up, even though the pandemic is much worse right now than we were in March and April when we closed everything down. We closed down too much. Well, we can talk about that in the Q&A, but we didn't close down smartly like Korea did and Germany did. However, opening everything back up, rushing to get back to normal life, when people aren't following social distancing guidelines, protocols, they are not following that. When they think that things are opening back up, they think they're very black and white thinking. So they don't sacrifice by wearing a mask. They don't sacrifice by socially distancing for the long-term future. They just go with their immediate short-term interest, which is not to be comfortable, which is to avoid being uncomfortable. And they don't think about the health consequences of that in the future for themselves and others around them. Or the business consequences if you open up too fast and you have people who are getting sick, and that definitely happens. So we prioritize the short term to the detriment of the long term, and we greatly underestimate these outcomes and impacts. So now time for another poll. All right. So take a look at the next poll. And I want to ask you, which of these cognitive biases is most problematic for your organization? So please go ahead and vote. The same poll, the same place. Go ahead and vote. Caitlin, thank you for sharing about Pfizer. I've seen these guidelines, and I really think that you want to be very careful with accepting information from companies about their own plans and agendas. That, and I don't want to criticize you, of course, personally, but companies, drug companies, have always exaggerate their timelines because that helps build up the share price. That has happened time and time again, systematically, and you never want to trust the word of drug companies. You want to trust the word of people who are neutral observers, who are experts in vaccine development, who don't have a financial stake in the game. And that's what the timelines are based on. This is just who you want to trust. You don't want to trust the word of drug companies. So just making that very clear. All right. So I'll give people 3 more seconds to vote, or 5 more seconds to vote before closing the poll. All right. So let's take a look at the results. We've seen some pretty balanced results. So the normalcy bias is one of the biggest problems, clearly. 30, just over a third of you believe it's normalcy bias. Planning fallacy, so failing to anticipate threats, risks, problems. And you know that as meeting planners, meetings never go according to plan, but strategic plans is something that many meeting planners don't incorporate the same mindset to. Planning fallacy, needing to change it quickly. And then a quarter look at hyperbolic discounting. Great. So let's take a look at the next steps. How do we address these problems? And what you want to be thinking about is going against your intuitions. Intuitions were great for early humans to help us survive, but not great in the modern world. So think about sugar, honey, bananas, whatever, or ice cream. In the savanna environment, it was very important for us to eat as much sugar as possible when we come across a source of sugar like honey or bananas or something like that. In the modern world, we have an overabundance of sugar. When somebody leaves a box of donuts in the break room, and they're served by the dozen, of course, it's very tempting when you start eating a donut to have more than one, or more than two, or more than three. It's very tempting. Or maybe your choice of poison is ice cream. You have a half gallon of ice cream. Did you know that serving of ice cream is a cup of ice cream? I mean, I have no idea who can actually eat a cup of ice cream. Show me this person. I don't know this person. So we tend to eat way too much sugar when we're triggered by sugar. It's very tempting to eat too much sugar. So instead, it's a much safer option, much healthier option to pass by those donuts and go for the sliced fruits, even though they're not as tasty and yummy and appealing, at least if you don't want to eat too much sugar. And that's an example of where you already go against your intuitions. I mean, nobody instinctively likes salad. Let's just be honest. You don't win friends by salad, to quote The Simpsons. Well, maybe some of you do now, but that's a learned habit. It's a learned habit to go for fruits instead of donuts. Kids like candy, they don't like fruits, mostly speaking. So you gotta understand that you're already doing this in some areas of your life, and you have to bring that same mindset to your decision-making in professional settings. You wanna change your organizational model to get to virtual meetings. And here are the 5 areas where you want to change it. Virtual meetings, relationships, managing disruptions, shifting norms, and unknown unknowns. Virtual meetings, first one. You want to make the transition to virtual as much as possible. That's really important, and you've probably heard this, but I'm stressing this again based on the fact that in all likelihood, 75% chance it's going to be somewhere between 2024 and later. So this is a bad situation if you are hoping for even the optimistic scenario, and that's 25% chance, and still to be more than a year away. So this is bad. You want to make the transition to virtual. And here are the things you want to consider. How can you create high quality, cost-effective virtual meetings? You want to focus on the key goals, same principles, focus on the key goals, and replace them with virtual experiences that will accomplish the same goals. For education, for example, you want to engage in interactive virtual formats, something like the polling. There's a reason I'm showing the polling and demonstrating how it can be used and how it can be played off against the attendees. So it's a way of interacting clearly. Even in a webinar, which is a short format presentation, even in a TED Talk style talk, you can use formats. You got to use great visuals, group activities for longer activities, of course, if you want to do a longer meeting or if you want to facilitate a meeting. So online engagement tools like Vivox and so on, not being paid by Vivox, I just like the tool. Zoom has a polling option, but it's much more difficult to use. You want to look for presenters with experience in quality virtual presentations. Ask for recordings, testimonials, and referrals. Specifically, what I recommend you do, here's a specific action point. Go to espeakers.com, which I hope all of you know as the main venue to get great speakers. It's a completely neutral website, and they came out with a new certification of virtual presenters, people who have that virtual certification. I got it. Other people who know how to do good virtual presentations get the certification, certifies that they do great virtual presentations, and you can see a sample of their virtual presentations. So you want to use that espeakers.com virtual, look at the virtual certification. Then think about networking. Use breakout rooms and other virtual networking tools. No time to demonstrate that, but Zoom has it and others do as well. Encourage you to run games, other engaging activities. So not simply polls, but as you facilitate activities, engage people together and help people, attendees, collaborate and have fun together. It's really important to replace that. Then technology. So thinking about your technology, you want to learn about various suppliers for virtual meetings, balancing usability, affordability, security, regulatory compliance. And there are a number of suppliers vetted by MPI, and Jerrica can tell you more about those, of course. So consider using those and help attendees, of course, learn how to use this new technology. So you got to give them guidance. Don't assume that they know. Other considerations. Develop appropriate ethical guidelines and protocols for virtual meetings. Just because meetings are moving to virtual doesn't mean that ethical issues are off the table. So we have to transform them for a virtual setting. You want policies and regulations, adapt them to virtual settings. That's something you really got to be focused on, and hybrid meetings as well. So hybrid meetings, virtual settings, meet diversity guidelines. So that's really important. Think about diversity, ADA guidelines, various sorts of guidelines with the ADA mechanisms for disabilities, and other requirements. And so you want to, as part of that, assess and manage risks effectively. As you do a risk management and assessment for in-person conferences, you got to do the same for virtual conferences and for hybrid conferences. Now, I mentioned hybrid conferences. As restrictions are lifted, here's where you want to think about hybrid meeting options. For example, I was recently a participant in the Columbus Metropolitan Club as a speaker on a panel, and it was a socially distanced panel. They usually have 4 people on the panel. In a socially distanced way, they can only have 3 people on the panel. And we had something like 12 people in the audience who were VIP presenters. And then it was broadcast over 25,000 people outside of that. So it's the Columbus Metropolitan Club. It was shown on TV, and 10 TV, WOC TV, here in Columbus, Ohio. So it's the biggest city club activity. And that's the kind of thing that you want to be thinking about. How you can get speakers there, and maybe some VIPs, a very limited amount, and then all, of course, socially distanced. A mask, I mean, have a speaker take off the mask when they're on stage, because, but otherwise everyone masked. And everyone attends virtually. Always go beyond the CDC guidelines, because you don't want your event to be a super spreader event. That is not something you want to be known for. All right, so you want to also be thinking about your relationships. How do you effectively cultivate new relationships and existing ones in the current virtual environment? Many people are not comfortable with this. It's not something that they are comfortable doing. So you want to think about people like attendees, suppliers, officials, funders. Governments are providing a lot of money for and that's something you want to be thinking about. Sponsors, volunteers, invest in professional development for yourself about how to do that. One of the difficult things that I've heard a number of my clients who are meeting planners say is, how do they convince sponsors to still be sponsors and exhibitors to still be exhibitors? There's professional development on how to do that. You can provide them with guidance. But you don't recreate the wheel. There's ways of finding out how to do that, and it's effective, and they will be calmed down. They will be less anxious. They'll be much more likely to buy into your proposals. Managing disruptions. Now you're seeing this presentation. You're seeing that at the baseline, the large majority of people are not making estimates that are in accordance with the reality, with the realistic probabilities of what's going on. Your external stakeholders won't. You are now going to be much more savvy, but most won't plan for the long-term disruptions. So you got to make a plan to protect yourself from their failures. Shifting norms. I already mentioned how norms will shift over time after several years of restrictions. People will have different habits, values, including around meetings, desires. You want to anticipate and get ahead of these shifts. Think about where people are going and get ahead of it, and that's how you'll make sure that your organization will survive and thrive, and your career will survive and thrive in this environment. And finally, manage the unknown unknowns. The pandemic was a predictable disaster. Most people think it's couldn't be predicted, but people like Bill Gates, very prominent people, were predicting and warning us about it. So you want to scan the environment for these sorts of major disruptors and protect yourself against them. And there are a number of, get pandemic insurance. A number of organizations that had pandemic insurance were really quite safe in this context of the pandemic. But not everything can be predicted. Solar flare, major solar flare, can't predict that. So you want to maintain some kind of cash cushion for protection. So that's the organizational model. And as part of that, I want to talk about how you plan for the long term. So looking at your strategic plan, talked about changing that. So you want to look at the possible futures, plan for a variety of them, and invest your resources accordingly. The optimistic one, the moderate one, that's the optimistic, of course, by 2022. Moderate one is by start of 2024, pessimistic by start of 2027. Well, that's when vaccine will be widely available. That's when people will start going back to conferences. Then think about what will happen in each of these scenarios if 5 years out. What will happen in the optimistic one, the moderate one, and the pessimistic one for your organization and your career. Then think about the problems. What kind of problems might there be for you, for your organization in each of these scenarios? In the optimistic one, in the moderate one, and the pessimistic one. And how can you address these problems in advance? Whether it's cash, whether it's knowledge, whether it's social networks, getting suppliers, getting prospects, making sure that the sponsors and exhibitors stick with you. You want to make a plan in advance. Some problems will come up. And some problems you don't know whether they'll come up. They might or they might not, but you can make a plan to address them on the spot if they do come up. And opportunities, this is a great time to be thinking about opportunities. There's always that silver lining where there's a major disruption is accompanied by some people going down, some organizations going down, but also many organizations, many people going up. So think about the opportunities in each of these scenarios and how can you bring about these opportunities. So for example, if you have, if you know that there are some prospects who are currently working with your competitors, you can do something like, and I have a number of clients who are doing this, saying, hey, here are steps A through F we took to be pandemic proof and to be prepared for the moderate scenario, for pandemic going much longer than people think. So if it does go longer and my competitor stumbles, consider talking to me about it. I'll be happy to help. And that's a way that you can make sure they have your name and they'll give you a call when they need you. Or make a plan to seize them if they do occur. Might or might not happen, but you can make a plan to seize this opportunity, like hiring away a great employee when they do occur. Think about the resources you'll need for each of these scenarios. For each of these scenarios, money, time, information, social capital, strategic planning, and so on. And make a plan to reserve sufficient resources for each one. Don't plan for the optimistic scenario. I know it's very tempting to do so, but it's very unlikely. And it's very dangerous to just plan for the optimistic scenario. Hope is not a strategy, and like Vince Lombardi said. And you got to think of, like Ray Dalio said, you got to think about the worst case scenario and protect yourself against it. So do that, please. And think about what information you'll use to assess which of these scenarios is taking place. Monitor it closely and adjust your plans accordingly and then execute. So for example, you can be following Bill Gates and what Bill Gates is saying. He's very deeply involved. You don't want to listen to what Pfizer is saying. Bill Gates knows what everyone is doing in vaccines because he's funding so many vaccines and he cares a lot about vaccination. He's getting 0 cents out of them, out of actual vaccination. He just really cares about the world. This is what the Melinda Gates Foundation is doing. So look at their timeline, look at their kind of optimistic assessments, moderate, pessimistic, what's going on, and follow that information. That's one way of doing it. There are many others. So I want you to take a look again at the polling. And I want you to think about how well adapted is your current strategic plan for the pandemic. So again, same place. How well adapted is your current strategic plan for the pandemic? Please vote. So while folks are voting, Wendy asked that you realize many of us on the webinar are employed by FAR. Yes, and I'm being direct and straightforward. I'm not necessarily going to, regardless of whether you're employed by pharma or not, I'm not going to varnish my words. I'm going to be very direct, very straightforward, and very clear. That's something you can trust me to be on. So, you don't want me to be straight, direct, and clear, don't hire me. I'm a very ethical person. So when someone asks me questions about, well, here's what Pfizer is saying, I give the direct, clear truth, clear facts. I'm a very factual, very ethical person, and that's what I am. And that's how I go. That's how I roll. So, you know, that's just what it's going to be. And that's what I'm like. And thank you, Johnny. I appreciate you sharing that. My honesty is appreciated. Okay, let's go to the polls. I'll give people about 5 more seconds to vote if you haven't voted yet. So I've got 5 more seconds to vote. All right. Great. So let's take a look at the results. Great. So for very well adapted, very few people, under 5% say your plan is very well adapted to the current stage of the pandemic. So it's good that it's very well adapted. I'm glad that you know that. And hopefully that means that you're preparing for the pessimistic scenario, or at least the moderate scenario, that your plan is already prepared for those scenarios, at least the moderate, ideally the pessimistic. For the large majority of you, you either have moderate tweaks needed or serious revisions. For the moderate tweaks needed, over half of you need some moderate tweaks. So you got to be thinking about what moderate tweaks you need, and again, planning for at least the moderate scenario, ideally a pessimistic one, and a large group of you, 40%, so 2 out of 5, need some serious revisions to the plan. So I gave you an outline both for the moderate revisions and for serious revisions, how you can use the 6-step process to go through it, go step by step, look at each one, and of course the webinar will be recorded. And let's not forget that you can get additional resources for this, for this presentation, for how to make a strategic plan. So you can have a free coaching session with me about how to adapt this information to your organization, to your career. I'll be happy to do that. So a free coaching session and a free digital copy of my new book, which I mentioned. That's what it's based on. I mean, if you want the paper, it's available. It's a traditional publisher. So Changemakers Books, great publisher. It's available in both paper and digital. And for you, I'll happy to send you a digital copy. You go to tinyurl.com/de-event. Again, tinyurl.com/de-event. And you can get a digital copy of the new book after you fill that out, as well as a free coaching session with me. And what I can tell you is that it will have the whole information about how to make an effective strategic plan, the book, what kind of cognitive biases to avoid, how to address the various problems in our thinking, and how to adapt your plan and your organization effectively to the problem that we're facing. Okay, if you look at the chat feature, you will see the link there, tinyurl.com/de-event. Again, tinyurl.com/de-event. Okay, so the link is there. I'll be happy to take questions, and they're going to be in the Q&A. Jerica, do you want to suggest some questions that I take?
No, yes. Thank you, Dr. Gleb, so much for your insight and your expertise. We really appreciate it. I'm going to take just a few questions from the Q&A function as we got a few minutes left. We had a viewer who wants to know, can you explain the current approach to the COVID treatment? And do you see an effective treatment plan in the works for those that experience early detection of a severe case?
So what we have, we currently have no treatment for people who have a moderate case, light case. We only have 2 treatments that have been shown to be effective, remdesivir, and increasingly there's a new steroid medication, or an old steroid medication that has been shown to decrease deaths by about, for people who have severe cases, by about 10 to 20%. 10% for those who have cases where they need to go to the hospital, 20% decrease for those who need to be on a ventilator. Then remdesivir has been shown to decrease hospital stay from 15 days to 11 days. So it decreases the morbidity, meaning how long you stay ill. And in that sense, it decreases the mortality, because obviously the longer you stay ill, the more likely you are to die. Those are the treatments we have. They're decreasing your hospital stay by that amount of time doesn't actually decrease your death rate by that amount of time, just decreases it slightly. So we have a decrease maybe of combined medication for the most severe cases of something like 25%. So 25% less people dying based on the current treatments. And we've been dealing with this obviously for already a long time, relatively speaking. I mean, China started researching treatments all the way from January. And by now, with 7 months out, so half a year out, we only found 2 treatments that have some effectiveness in addressing COVID-19, that decreasing, for the worst cases, death rate by 25%, which is great. I mean, if I'm doing one of the worst cases, if I'm in the hospital, I want those treatments, the remdesivir and the steroid medication. However, that's not really going to cut it for the large majority of us, and it doesn't do squat for preventing infections. So that does not prevent infections, and infections are spreading just as quickly. So we don't realistically, based on what we've been finding so far, we are unlikely to have a good course of treatment within the next year or two. So maybe something like, maybe some more medications will be found, but based on over 6 months of work, the fact that we only found 2 that seem to have real effectiveness makes me worried about the ability of really finding an effective course of treatment. That's why vaccine is really the only effective solution that I see, unless there's kind of miracle drug, which again, they're pretty unlikely given what we know. And given the family of coronavirus, we've been fighting the coronavirus, it's the flu, SARS, and so on, for a very long time, and we have no miracle pill for any of them. So given that, it's very unlikely that we'll find something for COVID-19.
Yeah.
Sorry,
No.
not great news.
Yeah, no, sometimes that news can be hard to swallow, but sometimes you just
Better medicine.
know that information. Yeah, it's definitely very important. Thank you for that. We have another question from one of our attendees who wants to know, do you know of any particular pharmaceutical companies that have vaccines in the pipeline, or is that something that you want to talk about?
Sure. Pfizer, as already mentioned, has a vaccine in the pipeline. Moderna has a vaccine in the pipeline already earlier. So Moderna has a vaccine in the pipeline. Johnson & Johnson has a vaccine in the pipeline. A number of other companies have vaccines in the pipeline. Moderna is the earliest one, and it's the one that is, because it's working with the NIH, the National Institute of Health, that's the one where we can have the most immediate trust about the credibility of the quality, because the NIH obviously cares about health and it doesn't care about profits for Moderna. It cares about health of Americans first and foremost. So it's kind of the mindset that you want to be taking. So the Moderna one, that's something that's going on, but we have to realize that all of these vaccines, all of them, have been created based on the original strain in Wuhan, China. And that's not the strain that's most common right now. And that's not the worst strain, and it's not the strain that's most common in the United States or in Europe or in other areas of the world right now. So we really don't know whether they'll be effective against the new strain that's very common right now. So that's a very big concern. And some of the companies that are developing the second wave of vaccines are taking this new strain into consideration, of course. But that's not something that we'll see. They're not going to be starting the trials yet. They're not even the first stage trial. So it's not great news in that sense.
Yeah. No, again, thank you so much on that. We are out of time today, but Dr. Gleb, we just want to say thank you so much for being here today, taking the time out, and just not only sharing your knowledge, but also sharing these resources and giving this to our speakers. So again, thank you so much for that. Do you have any closing comments?
Yeah, so I want to remind folks that if they have any more questions, and I know there are questions, I'm sorry that we didn't have time to get to, I will be happy to answer them in a free coaching session or by email. So I'll email you, a number of them will be answered, of course, in my book. So go to tinyurl.com/de-event, which is also in the chat notes. So go there and fill out the information, email me, and I'll send you an email with further resources, scheduling the session. And if you have any questions I can quickly answer by email, I'll be happy to answer those as well.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Gleb. Attendees, if you have any, I just want to do just a few touch points. today before we close out. I just want to let you know that you do receive clock hours for this course. Be sure and take that session evaluation. I know some people throughout the chat, just reading the comments, they had different viewpoints and suggestions on this webinar today. So if you want to go ahead and take that session evaluation and just kind of give us that feedback, we would greatly, greatly appreciate that. Leandra, I do see you were asking about handouts. If you go to that link that I have provided, as well as Emma, she just provided that as well in the chat. That's where you can get the resources for this webinar. There won't be any on your MPI site, but these are where you can get those resources. So since we don't have any more closing comments, again, thank you so much, Dr. Gleb, for everything you've done from the preparation to the delivery of this session. It is greatly, greatly appreciated. And everybody, just as a reminder, this is recorded and it will be uploaded in the on-demand section for everybody to go back and look out. So thank you so much, everybody, and I hope you stay safe and have a wonderful weekend. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.